Can you guys hear me? Boom. Yeah. Okay, should be recording. I'm gonna do this. Nice, okay. Ugh. Do we have any questions or anything before we get started, everyone? Still broke up for lab 3. Yeah, so they must have changed it. Has anyone gotten an answer from the TAs in regards to? I've had a lot of emails in regards to question 4. Has anyone gotten an answer from their TAs in regards to question 4 for lab 3? Do you want to type it out, Roland? Or can you respond? Oh, misclicked. Okay. So Paul added an answer. He said the TA assumed there was variability. Okay. Okay. So for everyone going to watch this via the recording and they can't see the group chat, 2 TAs told Paul and Courtney, so that would work for the entire class, to answer question 4 as if there was variability in conduction velocity between groups. Okay. Perfect. All right, guys. So now we're going to get started with today's lecture. Today we're talking about instruction and augmented feedback. So 2 parts to this lecture. I hope that you find that with the motor learning stuff, it's a lot more sort of like applicable to things that you kind of see in real life with teaching people, like things that you've sort of probably already noticed or that make sense. And this is just sort of reiterating research that confirmed these principles, really. So today we're going to be talking about demonstration and some of the specifics that demonstration has been used for in research to try to figure out the factors related to providing demonstration for improving motor learning. And then we're going to be talking about feedback. So providing feedback outside of the regular sensory feedback that you get when performing a task, things that you can add to a skill or to a learning environment to improve learning for the participant. So let's first start off with the demonstration component of this lecture. Is that okay, everybody? Awesome. Okay. So the research question that sort of spurred this idea is deciding which instructions to give people, or deciding what type of instructions to give people will work to improve their motor learning. Because if I ask you guys a question like this, how would you instruct someone to kick a soccer ball? What would be the easiest way for you to instruct a beginner in how to kick a soccer ball? Showing them, right? And does that make sense? Now, demonstration goes as typically the most popular or the most sort of utilized way to demonstrate motor skills. And that's for a lot of different reasons. But humans, which of our sensory processes do we make a priority? Vision, for sure. So Paul is right. So vision is such a priority for us that it makes sense that for us to visualize a demonstration of what we should be doing tends to work the best for us in terms of improving motor learning. And that's something that we've all probably seen, right? You would just ask anyone, how do you demonstrate this? Or how do you show someone, or how do you instruct someone to do a particular motor skill, right? So motor control and learning research wanted to look at if there's specific variables in relation to that idea that would sort of even improve demonstration, or is there certain times where demonstration is more important, right? Because the idea with motor learning research is now that we have this idea of how the body controls itself, how do we use that information to maximize the learning given a certain amount of time? Like, so if you have, you're teaching someone soccer and the kids only have 8 1-hour sessions, how do you get the most out of those sessions? You understand the principles of learning and then motor skill learning, and then you utilize those principles to improve or make a more efficient learning experience. So let's talk about demonstration. It's also called modeling, right? Because you're modeling the skill for someone. And it's the most common method to demonstrate how to perform a motor skill. And it's basically the way to make it a science is it's an instructional strategy that encourages observational learning for the participant. So we would have the beginners or the participants observing someone called the demonstrator performing the motor skill. And then we see them do that. And then we now have a better idea of how to move our bodies to perform that motor skill. What would happen if we don't have a demonstration? Then you would have, think about it this way. If I had a basketball and we had to do a free throw, if you take someone, you say you have to stand at this line and you have to get the ball into the hoop, but don't demonstrate it, they're going to go through a whole bunch of different ways to try to solve that problem before they figure out that that's probably the easiest way is to shoot it like we typically understand shooting a basketball. So think about how many trials that would take. Now, if you had another group where you just demonstrated it for them, they would know that right off the bat. So this is an example of how demonstrating can make things easier in terms of lower motor learning. So then the research question is, when or what are the specifics behind demonstration? And is there times where it's better or worse? Let's figure it out. Any questions? Okay, awesome. So studies that evaluated demonstration, they basically altered different factors to see if they could get a better idea of when it's best to use a demonstration. And the research questions asked, what do you think that when you observe someone doing a motor skill, so they're demonstrating it for you, what do you think that we are picking up? Oh, Ronnie said no. What did I ask, Ronnie? Oh, okay. Sorry. So then any of you guys, so Drew, Roy, or Ronnie, what do you think that we pick up when we're observing the someone doing a demonstration? It's taken from the slide. What we're specifically learning is the invariant features. So remember, the invariant features are the sort of like physical invariant features or movement patterns of that motion that make it that specific motor skill. So when you're demonstrating, we're basically showing how to move our bodies. We're showing the invariant features of that motor skill. And I mean, that's a huge jump to get from just the question to an answer, but I'll talk about the research that sort of prove that. And there's two types of research that support this idea that we pick up the invariant features from a demonstration when learning a motor skill. The two types of research are the visual perception of biological motion that we're going to talk about, as well as when we see changes in learners' coordination after they view a demonstration. So there's two types of research studies that have proven this idea that we pick up the invariant features. Do you guys remember what invariant features meant in terms of the motor program-based theory? The invariant features were what defined individual motor programs. So each motor skill we learned by developing a motor program, and skills were divided up by the individual motor programs, and a class of motor skill was defined by similar invariant features. So like different speeds of walking were all the same motor program in that sense, whereas different speeds of running, because they had different invariant features, was a different class of motor skill. So here we have an example of this whole visual perception of biological motion. And so we can see here where they had a study where they had to show someone a particular motor skill. And so what they found was that if they demonstrated by using the full body versus just using, see these points? And what they would do is they would have the points move in the way that do you remember when we used the infrared markers when doing like stop motion animation for like video games and stuff when we learned about kinematics? If you show the participants the movement of the dots, like the stick figures from like the animation, that will humans will be able to perceive biological motion from the movement of those dots. So you would see like, so this guy had to throw probably a piece of paper into like a basket or something. And so they wanted to demonstrate to participants, this is what you need to do for this motor skill. And what they did was they just showed the movement of the dots. And what they showed was that people were able to visualize that as an arm, and they were able to understand what to do in the motor skill just by seeing the dots. So in a way, what that proves is that we are picking up the invariant features. We are picking up the motion from a demonstration. Does that make sense? The other studies looked at so they would get a whole bunch of different people walking, and then you know how you see your friend walking, everyone has a specific gait. You can tell the specifics or the individuality of the gait patterns of individual people. So if you were to take a whole bunch of people and then analyze them and then use the dots, people were able to pick out which person corresponded with the movement of which dots. Like, we're able to perceive biological motion by just observing these dots. And so it sort of proves that we're picking up the invariant features. Does that make sense? Cool. Because in the next study, what they wanted to do is they wanted to see if they could change people's coordination based on the demonstration using this point light technique, so using the dots. And so what they found was that they had people trying to perform a slalom ski simulator. So this is a ski simulator. You go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And they counted how many times it would take people to learn how to do that effectively. And then what they did was a second group where they observed the dots of the person moving back and forth, and it led to a significant reduction in the amount of practice they needed to learn how to do this machine. And so what this suggested is that demonstration is most important and necessary when you want to have people develop a new pattern of coordination. If they don't have to develop a brand new pattern, then technically you could just talk about it, or they could probably figure it out just by words, because it's probably not like a quote unquote like complicated task. Complicated meaning that then requires a brand new development of coordination patterns. And so through these types of research, the two types of studies, what they kind of determined was that when we're watching a demonstration, we're picking up biological motion, we're picking up the invariant features of that motor skill. And it's best to use that when what we're trying to teach the people requires a change in coordination, a brand new, unique coordination pattern. And so those would be the specifics of when it's best to use demonstration. The next question is that if then we know that demonstration is most important, is it better to have a full view of the whole body, or is it better to have like a sort of demonstration of like the endpoint of the limbs? So let's say we're talking about a soccer kick. Is it better to see, like to learn how to do a soccer kick, is it better to see a full body do it? Or is it better just to have like, a stick figure of the leg or of even just the foot? Yeah, so research was actually it was inconclusive, right? So it's going to be dependent on both the skill level of the learners as well as the skill itself, because it also could be both, right? So you could be better to see full body initially, so you get a better so beginners get a better idea of what they're supposed to be doing, and then zoom in and have like a demonstration of like the foot flick. So they add in like, oh, how the foot should move. So coordination changes have been shown to be able to be occurred both with full body and endpoint demonstrations. It's going to be dependent on the task itself. And so what you would want to potentially evaluate would just see whether or not the skill that you're trying to teach the learners would require full body motion, or if it was just more specific to have motion of just the whatever distal segment that they are utilizing. Okay, so this is the conclusion that we talked about. And research then wanted to look at, okay, so if we've understood that we obviously pick up invariant features from observing biological motion or by observing demonstrations, that helps with learning and specifically learning new patterns of coordination. What is the brain area that is responsible for that? Now, did I ever show you guys a video of the mirror neurons? Do you guys want to watch this, or do you want to watch it on your own time? I think it's like 10 minutes long. Own time? Okay. Okay. But this is interesting because what it showed was that the area of the brain that is responsible for observing demonstration and putting that into like learning and motor programming is the premotor area. So the premotor area that does your like core activation before doing voluntary control of your body, that's the area that registers the demonstration. And the way that they figured that out was they had a monkey, and they were looking at the monkey learning what areas of the brain were activated when it was trying to reach for food. And then just one day, a researcher came in while the monkey was still hooked up and picked up the food itself, like himself. So like a person picked up the food instead of the monkey. And then the monkey's brain responded the same way. So they picked out, okay, so this area of the brain is activated versus when the person, regardless of whether the human, right, because humans and monkeys are very similar, regardless of whether or not the monkey picked up the food that was a peanut himself or observed it going on, the same part of his brain was activated, and that was the premotor area. And so they called those areas the mirror neurons, just in a sense that it's it's utilizing that to mirror your emotion based on what you're seeing. Okay. And so there's been other research looking at functional MRI to see, specifically if they could figure out what areas were involved or what pathways. And they saw that also the supplementary motor area was also involved. Now, some specifics when discussing when to use demonstrations, some factors regarding demonstration is that if we understand that demonstrating for someone is the best way to have them learn a new pattern of coordination, there is one principle that's important, is that the quality of the learner's attempt or how much they're learning is going to be dependent on the quality of the demonstration, right? So it's going to be important that if you are to demonstrate, you do have to take some time to understand what would be the best demonstration for them. You want a high quality demonstration, or else that's going to affect whether or not the person learns. So the guiding principle from research suggests that it's important for the demonstrator to perform the skill correctly, to guide the learning or the appropriate learning of the learner or beginner. So, other research has shown that beginners specifically can also learn from observing other learners. So one research question looked at, like, think about when you have a whole bunch of beginners in a room. Now, is it better to have everyone performing or practicing at once? Is there a benefit from having, learners observe other learners practicing? And what research has shown is that when you have beginners observing other beginners, it allows them to maintain sort of that cognitive process that's involved with learning. Now, remember when we talked about Gentile's stages of motor learning and the Fitz and Posner stages? Remember, there was the cognitive stage. So the cognitive stages. So when you are learning to perform a motor skill, the initial sort of part of learning is cognitively trying to figure out what to do to achieve the skill. And so what they suggest is that by having beginners observing other beginners, it allows them to maintain sort of that cognitive awareness of like learning successful and unsuccessful strategies, observing, what errors the other beginners are making. So it's helpful to have, learning in a group and have everyone sort of paying attention to each other, because it allows for the cognitive process to continue. Does that make sense, everyone? So if you were, like, who takes gymnastics or any real sport, right? You usually have someone do a demonstration, and then you have someone come up and practice while everyone else is watching, right? And then you maybe do that 2 or 3 times, and then everyone tries to practice, or you have half the group practice, and then you take turns. That's usually because not everyone can practice. Like, there's always size limitations with a lot of like different, like, learning areas, because I'm talking about sports right now. But that is helpful. So you're taking advantage of the space by having some. If, let's say, not everyone can practice at once, there's still a benefit of having half the group practice while the other group learns and watches, and then going back and forth. Because initially in the cognitive stages, in the initial stages of learning, it's all cognitive, right? It's all about like sort of understanding the movements and the unsuccessful strategies and error correction, trial and error, that kind of stuff. So the next question is that if we're gonna give demonstrations, when and how frequently should demonstrations be given? Anyone? Research has shown that demonstrations should precede practice. So obviously, you would want the observers to, the participants or the beginners to observe the demonstration before practicing. and research has shown that, and that the instructor should continue to provide demonstrations as frequently as necessary. And so typically what happens is you give learners the opportunity to self-select when they receive demonstrations. And research has shown that this is the most effective strategy when utilizing demonstration throughout a practice. And so here's an example of a study that sort of proved this. And so this was one study where there was people learning how to do an overhead volleyball serve. And so there's 3 different groups. There was a group that had, so each group had 10 demonstrations and 30 serves. One group had all 10 demonstrations and then 30 practice serves. The interspersed group had 1 demonstration and then 3 practice attempts, 1 demonstration and 3 practice attempts, and continued on. And then the last group, the combination group, had 5 demonstrations and then 15 attempts. So each group had 10 demonstrations and 30 serves, or 30 practice trials. But the difference was when they received the demonstrations. And so what the research looked at was when they evaluated who had learned the best based on score, they found that the group that had all pre-practice and combination was better. So it sort of proves it. Does that make sense, Paul? Now, why do you think is one reason why the interspersed, so when you had like a demonstration, then practice, demonstration, practice, demonstration, practice, why would that be a reason of why it led to poorer learning? Anyone? Anyone? Yeah, so Ivan's right, because it's stopping them, right? Because remember, in the cognitive stage, the initial stages of learning, through trials, they're cognitively trying to figure out what to do, and they're learning their own body, doing trial and error, and they're sort of putting it all together, right? Exactly. So Ronnie's right too. Everyone's right. Because by having like demonstrations, like you're stopping them from like the trials of practicing, you're stopping them, they have to demonstrate again, and then you need them to have them time to sort of figure stuff out for themselves. By giving them a demonstration, you're giving them sort of the invariant features so they can understand the coordination pattern, and then they got to do it themselves. For them to learn, they've got to process it cognitively. And so that's what it shows in theory, or sorry, in these 2 theories here. So why does observing demonstrations influence learning? There's the cognitive mediation theory that suggests that by observing movements or the invariant features, it's translated into the memory code. So it suggests that by observing it, it's going to be part that's imprinted when you're learning. It's going to be put together and imprinted into a greater sort of like memorization of that motor skill. And the other group is that this was based on mirror neurons, that when you observe a demonstration, your motor areas are automatically sort of constrained to match those invariant features. So it's less of a memory issue and more of a constricting of the body's movement patterns to match what was observed in demonstration. Now, in real life, it's probably both, right? They're just theories as to what potentially could be happening. Now, so is there, based on that, we've got a good basis of demonstration. Do you think that there's any downsides of understanding or showing demonstrations to people? The 2 that I could think of is that there's unlikely an ideal movement pattern for all learners. Now, what was one of the factors when studying motor skills or motor control is that how do you sort of like divide up the motor skills? Because what is one factor that we see? You have, the skill or the goal of the skill is to achieve a particular goal. So for baseball, I want to pitch and go from the ball to go from the mound to the catcher. Now there's different ways that I can throw it. Does that mean I didn't do the skill? No. The thing is that everyone based on anthropometrics and sort of the way that they move their bodies will achieve it with a little bit of a different motion. So there's unlikely, an ideal movement pattern when demonstrating for someone that matches what everyone should do. So that's one factor to consider. Now, typically, depending on a lot of different sporting techniques, there's sort of the general right way to do it. And so it's just a factor to sort of consider. And then the other thing too is that if you are potentially demonstrating too much, you're sort of inhibiting that learning cognitive phase. So there's just two characteristics, two factors that we need to be conscious of. Any other sort of like comments or concerns anyone has about that material? Awesome. So now we're going to talk about verbal instruction and cues. So verbal instruction, so providing verbal instructions is another common way of communicating how to perform a motor skill with people, right? So versus demonstrating, verbal cues or verbal instructions is another way to sort of provide that information. Probably the second most common. And so research wanted to look at maybe some of the factors in relation to verbal instructions and cues. So things to consider when providing verbal instructions to beginners is that you want to work within the working memory limits of humans. And so remember our short-term or working memory capacity is 7 plus or minus 2 items. And it lasts for about, what, 30 seconds? So you want to make sure that if you're going to give someone instructions on what to do to perform a motor skill, it's really brief because you can't give them a long list of instructions or they're not going to be able to translate that into their memory because it's past what we can sort of process in our short-term memory. And then the second point about when providing people verbal instructions, what do we learn in research? Is it better to have beginners concentrate on their movements? So focus internally or focus externally on the goals of the motor skill that they're learning? Right. So initially, it's good to have people think internally to sort of process what they need to do. And then ultimately, you need to switch that focus externally. So that way, when people are performing the motor skill, they're thinking about the goal. Because when you are like, for example, having chokers are when they revert back to an internal focus. So you want to make sure that the verbal instructions or verbal cues that you're giving people when they're learning motor skills, that you may want to start off initially internally so that they're aware, but you want to make sure that their verbal cues aren't going to allow them or aren't going to force them to keep an internal focus. You want to always get that focus externally because when we're performing motor skills, with looking at the eye goggles, what is one thing that sort of differentiates an expert versus a beginner? What the expert's able to pick out in a small amount of time, they're able to pick out all of the relevant regulatory features. You need them to focus externally to be the best at the motor skill. Does that make sense, everyone? Victoria? Selena? Everyone's good? Boom. This was one study where they looked at giving someone like external versus internal instructions. So do you remember the slalom ski simulator at the beginning of the lecture? So they did that machine, and the goal was to go from, so they had two groups. They told one group, use this machine, and your goal is to go from all the way from one end to the other, over and over and over. And then they told the other group that you have to do that, but concentrate on making sure your weight pushes as you cross over the middle. And then what they showed was that the two groups, the group that was given external focus, learned much better than the group that was provided an internal focus. And then what they did was they even did a second study where they had the people that were learning. So they had them focusing externally, and then they gave them those internal instructions, and it decreased their performance. So these two studies just show that an internal focus, or sort of reiterated the fact that having learners focus internally led to a poorer learning or a poorer performance in the motor skill. Interesting, right? So you want to keep things external. Now, some other sort of characteristics or factors to consider when using verbal instructions, and this comes from the memory lecture. It's important and helpful to use verbal analogies. So when you give verbal analogies, an analogy allows for a greater memory representation because it allows them to sort of comprehend something that they've encountered before, like golfers with the whole clock example. They can understand what a clock looks like, and so it allows for a greater visual representation of what they should be doing. So it encourages implicit learning because you're making an analogy of something they're knowing about when you're sort of providing the instructions. So it's a better instruction because they can now relate it to something visual. Now, this part is when we want to focus attention on the external environment. That relates to the fact that experts tend to have a much greater ability to pick out the regulatory features. So when providing verbal instructions and cues, it would be great to sort of, encourage the external focus that is required when, having the best performance of that motor skill. And then the last thing is they can also give verbal instructions to sort of influence different goal strategies. So in the beginning, think about beginners versus experts. When you're first learning something, we typically do it slower, right? Because we want to be more accurate. So for example, providing a verbal cue of, oh, wait, slow down when beginners are learning is to try to, because it's better to go slower to develop the movement pattern and then you can speed it up. So those are just sort of three characteristics or three factors to consider when providing verbal instructions. This study here, it just showed that what it was that people had to do a 60-second pursuit task. So do you remember when like doing continuous motor skill studies? Typically, you have a mouse and someone's following a cursor on the screen because it's a continuous skill. So they had participants doing this 60-second target pursuit task with, I don't know if you guys can see it, but you get like with a mouse and cursor. And so each 60-second block for the participants was 3 segments of 20 seconds. And for each participant, the initial segment was the same, but they weren't, the participants weren't told that. And so because the following two 20-second segments were different, the performance and their ability to do that was less because it was a brand new pursuit task each time. The participants weren't aware that the initial segment was the same for each trial, even though it showed that they did significantly better in the first 20 seconds because they kept practicing the same one. They knew which way it was going to go. So it just shows that you can be learning and unaware that you're learning. Kind of a convoluted way to show that, but that was something that this study showed. That's why I brought it up. So generally speaking, right, given everything that we just talked about, you want verbal cues to be short and concise, and they detect attention to, you could use the cues to, remember to focus on things in the environment. You could also use it to prompt certain movements. And so verbal cues are a little bit different than verbal instruction because the cues would be things that you're provided, like, so you give verbal instructions and then they practice. You could also have them practicing and then add in verbal cues for them while they're practicing. So it's a little bit different than just verbal instructions. Cues are provided to be given while they're practicing. And if you're going to tell them things while they're practicing, typically you want that to either have them focus on things in the environment or to prompt certain actions. So verbal cues in research and in different experiences have been added to demonstrations to direct. So let's say you have someone demonstrating something, you can add verbal cues so that they know what to focus in on when, like, it helps with like improving the demonstration. Because if you do a full body demonstration, there's a lot of moving parts. Potentially the beginner is like, well, what's the most important part of the moving body? So by adding verbal cues, it's like, oh yeah, direct to that part of the demonstration. You could have verbal cues provided to beginners or learners to have them focus their attention on specific aspects, so whether in the environment or on particular parts of their body. You can do verbal cues as prompts. Does anyone, any gymnasts or dancers? I feel like there's got to be a gymnast or a dancer in the class. So Violetta, can you think of any examples where you use sort of like verbal cues in teaching or when you're dancing? Like, can you talk about sort of like an example? If you unmute your mic, you can talk too. I don't mind. Or did you ever not use like verbal cues in dance? Oh, here we go. Okay, so Violetta's just saying. So what she said is, well, I finished fitness and health promotion in college. We had to memorize every different cue for every exercise. Oh, okay. So you're providing verbal cues when you're teaching someone how to do a particular exercise? Okay. And so so who works out at the gym, right? Think of like personal trainers that are like give an example of a verbal cue. What would be a verbal cue for pick an exercise and tell me? Awesome. Sit down in a chair. Perfect. So I guess you could demonstrate it and then go down and say sit down in a chair and then push, right? And then so that way they could see it in the demonstration. Then when they're practicing, you repeat it like the prompt, like sit down in a chair and they're going down, up, they do it, and then back up. So you can see how that can be. So this is a cue. It's not a verbal instruction. It's a cue as they're performing it. It's something that can be provided to the learner to sort of encourage what they're, as a prompt and what they should be doing. Does everyone understand that? Oh, Selena said, in physio, I teach my patients pelvic tilting by comparing it to tilting a bucket back and forth. Perfect. So that would be something that you could provide in terms of instructions, right? So you could show them, right? This is what you do, or you could show them plus give them an analogy, and that's going to allow them to like, oh, okay, I understand. Because I don't know who works in a clinic, but how many times you demonstrate something for a patient, and then they like, oh yeah, I saw that, and then they do like, buddy, like so. Every time I'm like, okay, all you gotta do is like rotate across top. You take the band and you like do this, and then all patients are like, like they just like, or they do this, or they do, they do that, they do like weird stuff, and we take it for granted because I guess as King grads we're more sort of like aware, like physical awareness and stuff, but you have to understand that like a lot of people aren't coming from that. All good, guys? Cool. So, do you guys find this material, super difficult? I really feel like the last 3 lectures of this course are like super applicable to like so many of the stuff that we're already involved in. So hopefully you find that too. Because if you're aware, if you can relate what we're talking about in class to things you've already noticed or have been doing, you're going to memorize it so much better. Because it's a greater representation in memory, right? That's why I like adding clinical examples or making really good examples for you students in all my classes, because it leads to better understanding, but then therefore a better representation in your memory. Everyone good? Boom. Oh, we got a Nadine showing. Cool. Okay, what's up, Nadine? Okay, so now we're going to finish off, sorry, not finish off. We're the second half of this lecture, we're going to be talking about augmented feedback. Okay, now the concept is that augmented feedback is providing information to learners that can help enhance or facilitate skill learning. Okay, so when you have a motor skill or you have someone practicing a motor skill, there's 2 types of feedback that is provided or could be provided to the person that is performing the motor skill. So whatever it is, there could be task intrinsic feedback, which is the normal sensory or perceptual information that your body is naturally like perceiving when performing the motor skill. And then there's augmented feedback. Augmented meaning it's added, like it's additional. So it's additional feedback that's added to the motor skill that is separate from what is just naturally sort of provided through your body. So it enhances task intrinsic feedback. So when you're looking at feedback, so give me an example of a motor skill. Nadine. Anything. Just say any motor skill. Or get an example of any motor skill. Because we're going to talk about feedback. Sure, walking. Okay. So what would be the task intrinsic feedback? So the feedback that you're receiving from your body or you're aware of when you're naturally walking. So you can look at the slide too. But we would be getting, visual information from our eyes. You could be hearing footsteps. You could be hearing, cars moving or the beep from the stop light, the stoplight, the stop sign or stoplight or whatever, when there's like the beeping for the hearing impaired people. Is that still a term? I don't know. Proprioceptive information would be coming from your joint receptors and your muscle spindles. Tactile information or sensory information can be coming from your feet. Maybe you're walking on, grass versus a sidewalk, or it's getting slippery, you'd be able to feed that. All of this information that we just talked about, that's from your normal sensory processes. So things that we're aware of or feedback that we're aware of as we're performing a motor skill. So because it's naturally occurring, that's called task intrinsic feedback. Augmented feedback is anything that would be added on top of that. So externally. So imagine you were having a stroke patient that's relearning walking. You have a coach with them or a physio or an occupational therapist or a rehab specialist or a kin or whatever that's saying, here's the cadence of your step. Keep step, 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 step. It's more feedback that's added externally than what the person would naturally be aware of if they were just doing it themselves. So do we understand the difference between task intrinsic feedback and augmented feedback? So then the question in terms of motor learning with this course and with, sort of motor control and learning research is that, okay, what can we add? What sort of augmented feedback is important for what types of skill to provide during learning so that the person can learn better? What are some of the factors in relation to providing people feedback that will enhance their learning or make it worse? Like, what are some of the factors? And so there's two types of augmented feedback. There's knowledge of results, which is what's called KR feedback, and there's also knowledge of performance, or KP feedback. So these are both externally provided information. Knowledge of results is externally presented information that talks about the outcome of the skill. Whereas knowledge of performance is externally presented information talking about the movement characteristics. So remember we talked about outcome measures versus production measures when evaluating motor control research, like lecture 2. Similar to that, but this is talking about augmented feedback. So there's KR feedback, which is going to be providing someone information about how they did. And then knowledge of performance, or KP augmented feedback, is more about how they did it, more like the movements. Outcome, movements. Both are important. And then we're going to look at when would be most important to get KR versus KP, depending on the situations. So here, let's talk about some examples of KR versus KP. So golf instructor, think of you're the instructor, you're teaching someone how to play golf, and they practice swing, they see the ball go, and then you're going to add more feedback to them than they naturally got to try to improve their learning. So if you're going to give them knowledge of results, or KR, you could say that your shot went to the right rough. So you shot and it went too far to the right, if you didn't notice. If you gave them information about their performance, or KP, you're talking about their movements. So that kind of feedback, or augmented feedback, would be you began your downswing before you finished your backswing. So you can see how the initial example was talking about the outcome versus the second example, the KP, is talking about their movements. Make sense? Yeah, care would be like sort of like externally talking about the outcome. It's external focus. So I wouldn't say it's more about the big picture. I think that it would be more accurate to say it's more about the outcome, the overall outcome. Because when we talk about, for example, like look at the physical therapist example of using augmented feedback with someone. So think of like a stroke patient, right? Talking about the outcome, so KR, so knowledge of results, you walked 10 feet further today than you did yesterday. Great job. So he's giving them awareness. Oh, I did that much further today. Whereas knowledge of performance, so the movements, the physical therapist would say something like, you should bend your knees more as you walk, because they're talking about like the movement patterns. One interesting thing in terms of, like, in all the professional leagues now, the best way to give people augmented feedback is showing them video replay. Because video replay, you get to observe yourself doing it. And so it gives you a better representation because you're visually watching your own body. So you did the task, you had your own task intrinsic feedback, you watch a video replay of it, and you're like, oh, it's giving you so much more information. So there's lots of different examples of what augmented feedback is. It's any feedback, person talking, a video screen, a printout of like any information that's added on top of what the person would like just generally or naturally be aware of when doing that motor skill. So augmented feedback will play two roles in skill learning. So it can be used to provide information to the learner to facilitate achievement of the task or more learning. So you could be using augmented feedback to have them better understand what they did, how they did it, what needs to be done, how to perform the skill, providing information about the skill itself, so facilitating learning. The second thing that augmented feedback does is it can motivate the learner. right? Because if you're commenting on what they're doing, it can help allow the learner to be motivated. I'm aware I'm getting better. It can be a motivational technique to provide feedback to make sure that the person doesn't go through a plateau. Because what did we talk about last day? Performance plateaus. And what's an example of what could be a reason why there's a performance plateau? People are getting bored, so they're not cognitively concentrating on what they're doing, right? And then therefore they're not learning. You need to keep that cognitive process going. You need to keep the participants motivated. So by providing augmented feedback, you're obviously facilitating learning and giving them information, but it's also a motivational technique. So it does two different things. So given that fact, augmented feedback when skill learning can be essential. It can be not necessary, it can enhance learning, or it could hinder or slow learning. Okay. So, oh, what if giving advice is bad? Yeah, so exactly. So we're going to talk about this in the next couple of slides, but if you give the wrong advice, the person, a learner, have you guys ever like played like intramural sports or like, I don't know, like men's league, anything like hockey, where there's like the old guy that thinks he knows everything, or there's like always the people on the team that just are so loud that they think they know everything and they're just like getting in your ear? Human nature is that we're going to listen to feedback regardless of whether or not it's right or wrong, right? So you got to be cognizant of that. If you're going to provide, so we're going to learn that augmented feedback can be really good to enhance learning, but if you give them the wrong information, you're hindering their learning. Because like kid sports, like every parent's got something to say, right? So you got to be cognizant of, well, as a coach, how many times is anyone a coach? Don't listen to the parents, listen to me. How many times have you heard that or said that? For sure, right? Because you don't have and especially as a beginner, you don't have a huge knowledge structure of the motor skill. So you don't know if what you're listening to is right or wrong. You have no idea. You're not sort of experienced in it. So augmented feedback from a rehab perspective is essential when the learner can't use task intrinsic feedback to complete the task. So they cannot see their target or their goal, or because of an injury or disease, they need to substitute feedback because they don't have enough information to achieve it for themselves. So in those situations, when talking about rehab settings, a lot of times augmented feedback is essential for skill learning. When we're talking about like, Parkinson's and learning how to balance, right? They see a visual of, oh, this is how I have to balance, right? It would be so hard to teach them how their center of mass is moving without that information. Augmented feedback is not necessary when there's situations where the motor skill is provided sufficient task intrinsic feedback. So when skills people just learn themselves, it may not be necessary. We're going to learn that for the majority of the time when you provide the most appropriate augmented feedback, it enhances learning. So it speeds up the learning process. And then we talked about with Apollo when talking about how if you give the wrong advice or the wrong augmented feedback, the beginners will learn it and it will hinder learning. Am I going too fast? Are you guys okay? Good speed. Awesome. Okay, so here's an example of whether or not. So because the question was, okay, so if I'm giving augmented feedback, we know that it can motivate people. Maybe it's not about what you're saying. Maybe it's just the idea of motivating someone will help them learn. And so what they did was they had people practicing a basketball shot. And so they had two groups. One, the group that was given augmented feedback. In this case, it was KP. And the other group was just given encouragement, just to see if the idea was that the actual information in the augmented feedback was important, and it did show that it led to improved learning. So it's not just about motivation; it's about sort of the details of the augmented feedback. So let's talk about that context of augmented feedback, because remember who your audience is. You got to make sure that if you're going to give feedback or augmented feedback, if it's in the form of, verbal, or if it's from a display, or even from video replay, the learner must be kind of like aware of what you're talking about, so they should be able to sort of process the information. So there's just some, like the next slides are talking about some factors to consider when providing augmented feedback, whether it be knowledge of results or knowledge of performance, when providing that information to the learners. So here are some 5 issues to consider. So I'll ask Antonius this. Is it better to give information about the errors that someone is doing, or the correct aspects of the performance? So you're going to give someone feedback on how they did. Is it better to tell them their errors, or is it better to tell them what they did right? So no right or wrong answer. However, what research has shown is that giving the correct aspect, like Apollo is saying, is better for beginners to motivate them. And then once they're like pretty good, then you can start sort of giving them the errors to help them understand, because they have a better sort of representation in their a cognitive understanding of what the skill is in their head. Does that make sense? Cool. So then Nadine, you're up next. Is it better to give someone knowledge of results or knowledge of performance? So information, augmented feedback about the outcome, or augmented feedback about their movements? Yeah, so it depends on the learner. So like I said on the slide, so they would suggest that knowledge of results, so giving information externally about the outcome, is better to provide motivation. That makes sense, right? It's better for learners if you give knowledge of results, just the outcome. They can sort of use that information to confirm their own self-assessment of performance. It allows them to adopt an external focus of attention, because you're not focusing on their movements. And then by providing them just KR, it allows them for self-discovery, which is important, right? The cognitive aspect. If they figured it out for themselves, they're not going to forget it, because they had that moment where they processed it. Whereas knowledge of performance, or the movements, is going to be important if like you're already like, understanding, like, so you're already skilled and you're trying to really correct something, then you can give them more specific information about their performance movements. Or when, let's say the skill, we were talking about this earlier in the lecture, that, when talking about a very difficult skill for beginners, sometimes it's better to initially start with internal focus, so they're aware of their movements. So knowledge of performance, so KP, augmented feedback, may be appropriate to be given to beginners when they are learning a new pattern of coordination. So just what Nadine is saying, that knowledge of results versus knowledge of performance augmented feedback, there's different times to use each, and there's benefits of each. You just want to sort of evaluate the skill and sort of the state that the learners are in, and some of the factors, obviously, that were detailed on the slide, to provide which one, or even both. Is it better to give qualitative information or quantitative information? So qualitative information would be, you did good or bad, versus quantitative would be more specifically talking about like how they did in the specifics of their movement. It may be better to provide qualitative information in terms of feedback in the early stages of learning, to provide sort of a gross understanding to the learners and provide them to stay motivated. And then you give them quantitative feedback as they have already sort of developed the motor pattern. One factor that we talked about is remember when we were talking about demonstrations? Is it better to give demonstrations all at the beginning or all the way through? And why was that, Apollo? I forget who said it. I think Colin said it. Well, they get more reps, right? You're not stopping their learning. So then the question is that, okay, if we've learned augmented feedback is generally good, right? It's a way to enhance learning. And the factors in the previous slide would be what you want to consider when giving augmented feedback. Okay, you know that. That's perfect. Now, do you give augmented feedback all the time? You want to be careful because you don't want to ruin their learning moments, right? You don't want to stop them from learning. So like Apollo was saying, by giving augmented feedback all the time, you may be limiting the amount of reps that they're getting or the amount of trials. So the best way typically they do in research, but also like in real life, and you guys can maybe give me some examples, is you only provide augmented feedback based on error size. So what's called performance bandwidths, where you would only provide, so let's say there's a certain amount of error, you only provide augmented feedback when they're outside of that error bandwidth. So as they get better and better, they're getting not outside of that bandwidth, and they're only getting augmented feedback or feedback a less number of times. Does that make sense? Sweet. And then the last part when we were talking, I think was it Apollo? Antonius? Well, let's see. Who said that? It was Apollo, I think. Yeah, it was Apollo. When saying that, you got to be careful about erroneous augmented feedback because people, humans, will take the information, the feedback, regardless of whether or not it's right or wrong. And a study that proved that was this study right here. So you had, it was an aiming task, and then one group received erroneous KR. And you could see that compared to the other groups, this group got significantly poor learning because they were given the wrong feedback. And then this group right here, they were given the right feedback and then given wrong feedback. And you could see that even though they had already learned a little bit, providing erroneous feedback caused them to hinder their learning or their performance. Weird, right? So that's why they separate the parents from the kids when they're learning, because they will just pick up everything and it's going to ruin their learning. Is anyone a coach? Get anything? No one's a coach. I guess none of us are coaches right now. Thank you, COVID. Cyber, I didn't die from the vaccine. Intern coach. Oh, I'm an intern coach. I like it. I'm more of a life coach. I feel like I'm setting you guys up for the real world. Okay, so Riley, or Selena, I didn't mean to make fun of you. Like, unless intern coach is a term of what you actually do. I'm sorry. And then Riley said that they coached goalies in ice hockey, and so like, is any of what we're saying today applicable or sort of like? Obviously, it is, but what stands out as things that you've sort of like? What part of the material is standing out with your experience, or stands out to you in regards to your experience with coaching goalies? Yeah, sweet. There you go. See, I didn't make this stuff up. Just half of it. Parents of each other kids also. Yeah, there you go. Exactly, right? Because they think they know it. It's just like, yeah. And this just sort of just proves it. So let's talk about specifically now knowledge of performance. So we talked about when it's, some of the factors in relation to when it's best to use knowledge of performance when giving someone feedback when they're learning a motor skill. There's different types of ways. There's different ways to provide like knowledge of performance feedback. The main way is usually verbal. So you would have Riley as a coach. She's having her, or they are having, I don't know how you pronounce. Riley is having the beginners practice a skill and then is going to provide knowledge of performance for them. Okay? So you're going to give them information about their movements as they're performing the motor skill. You're going to give them feedback. Okay? That's what was an example of verbal knowledge of performance or verbal KP. There's two types. There's descriptive KP and then prescriptive KP. So if I'm going to be talking about their movements, I can be descriptive in what they did. So describe only the error or the way that they did their movements. Or prescriptive would be telling them their error and how they need to change it. So you're prescribing how they need to change their movements. So is it better to give descriptive KP or prescriptive KP? And then it relates to the skill level of the learner. For beginners, they're probably going to need information on what they did wrong, but how to fix it. Whereas people that are already sort of advanced in that motor skill only need to know what they did wrong because they already have an awareness of what they need to do to correct it. Does that make sense? Everyone? Cool. Okay. Another way, and this is probably the most common way now for professional athletes, is video replay, right? Check the tape, check the tape, check the tape. Video replay is an excellent way for providing feedback to the participants, whether it be beginners or athletes or whatever in this case. It's a great way to provide information of the knowledge of performance. Now, in terms of providing video replay to people, if you were to take a beginner and then just show them a replay of what they did, they're going to see themselves, but you want to make sure that you're picking out things of the video replay that they want to sort of concentrate on. So video replay is really good because it's visual, which is great for humans, but keep in mind that for beginners, you need to point out what they're supposed to be looking at because they still don't have a greater, understanding of the motor skill specifically. Here's an example of using movement kinematics. Let's get it up. So you can use technologies to have or to provide KP feedback to learners. So here's an example of people being taught how to use a rowing machine. So they're learning how to row. And so they're providing new feedback other than just have the person practicing on a boat. They figured out a way that they could have different types of KP feedback provided to the learners and see what led to, the fastest learning. Can you guys all see this on the screen? So this is visual feedback. So this is what you're supposed to do with the oar. Now we have a screen that's going to have a tracing of the movement pattern. So that's giving them the visual feedback based on, so this is where they're moving and what it should look like. This is using an auditory feedback. So every time they're outside of like the appropriate pattern, they get a tone. So see that, like it's like an error, like a buzzer. Catch trials are just practice. Haptic feedback. You guys know like rumble packs on like your video game controllers? Haptic is they feel it. So they would get a sensor in the oar when they're outside of the movement pattern they should be doing. And then terminal feedback, this is just examples from this example. Terminal feedback is when they get a tracing after they're done, they get to see what they did, see? So all types are feedback. That's all augmented feedback. And it's talking about their movement, not about the goal of what they did. How far did they row, right? Or overall that you did well. It's giving them knowledge of the movements that they provided. So it's KP, and it was visual, auditory, haptic, terminal. So we can think of other examples of how KV is provided using different technologies. There's tons. Can anyone think of any other ones? I thought this was a good one because it had several examples in one video. Here's an example of biofeedback. So I don't know if you guys have seen this, but this was marketed. So here's an example of a relaxation machine. And so what it does is it registers the EMG activities of your trap muscles. So when you're doing different postures, and I'll turn down the sound, but when you're doing different postures, you can understand of whether or not your traps are being fired or not, like whether or not you're like really tense, which would lead to more, neck problems. But you can see, we see this a lot in rehab settings too, where we put EMG on different muscles, and then we can have, the patient observing the monitor that's going to let them know if they're contracting their muscles. Do you guys remember doing this in lab? Did you guys ever do EMG lab before the big Rona of 2019? Have you guys all used EMG in the lab where you got to flex the muscles and then you could see which muscles you're firing? Oh, I'm sorry. But EMG is these pads, right? And then you put the pads, kind of looks like this, you put them on the muscles, and then it is a machine that like sort of reads electrical activity of the muscles. So then if it's reading activity, technically, then you can understand that the muscles are on. Yeah. Here we had whether or not, so looking at the difference between types of KP. This is golf, and it showed that video replay was better than verbal feedback, which relates back to the previous slide that had said that video replay is sort of like the best way to sort of provide feedback for augmented feedback for learners. And you can see that post test, the video replay people were the best. Here's an example that was done in 1945 of a paper tracing that was used for people to understand how to use a machine. So it was a machine that had to be operated with the foot pedal. And so by having a paper tracing, it gave them the way that their foot should move. So just examples of providing augmented feedback. So the last part that we're going to finish off, and then we're almost done, is talking about timing issues related to augmented feedback. Now, is it better to provide feedback while the person is performing or at the end of the practice attempt? And so there's going to be factors that are sort of needing to be considered in both. So concurrent augmented feedback can either enhance or have a negative effect on learning. And because remember, when you are providing augmented feedback, you're giving additional feedback in addition to what the person is already sort of just aware of with task intrinsic feedback. So providing them feedback can enhance learning by giving them more awareness. But if you give concurrent feedback continually, it may result in the learner becoming dependent on that. And the general rule is that humans they'll become accustomed to the sensory feedback, the feedback that's available during practice. Whatever is available, they'll become dependent on it because they'll get used to performing the motor skill with that feedback. So if in a test situation, they're not going to be provided some of the feedback, you could be sort of decreasing or hindering their learning by making them dependent on a particular sort of amount of feedback that won't be present. And so the idea is that when you have concurrent feedback, so do you remember the example of when people were practicing putting 30% of their body weight when using a crutch? And so they had a force plate. And so there was people that got the monitor screen that told them how much they were putting their weight on. And there was the people that got the information after. In practice, the people that had the display performed the best, but then on the tests, they performed the worst. Do you guys remember that? It's because they became dependent on feedback that was available. That's augmented feedback that they were given. They were actually given the amount of body weight that was being registered on the force plate. So then they could just look at the screen and they got used to it. But in real life situation, they're not given the screen. And because it was available in practice, they became dependent on it. So that's just a factor to sort of consider when providing augmented feedback. If you give it concurrently, it's great to help improve, but you want to start taking it away or else the learners will become dependent on it. Things to consider when providing terminal feedback. So therefore you let them practice and then you give them the feedback after they're done, a practice trial. There's two things to consider. So here, I'm going to try to explain this for you guys. So can you guys see this little sort of line on the screen? I'm not going too fast. You guys are okay? Almost done. You guys okay? Okay. So here we have COS R1, R2, RN. This is a repetition of them performing a particular motor skill, whatever it is. Okay. So they try it once, second, third, fourth, fifth, right? So in between each trial, the people are provided knowledge of results. So KR. So they're given feedback. Okay. And this was really interesting study because what it showed was that, so they do their practice, then they're given, feedback. Do their practice, then they're given feedback. Practice, feedback. So research defined it as there's the KR delay interval or the post KR interval. So they wanted to look at if there's something that they could have participants or beginners do in the time period between trials. So either before or after they get their results, their augmented feedback, is there something that they can do during, the different trials that will help improve learning? And so what they found was that if you had people engaging in different activities between trials, it could hinder, benefit, or have no effect on skill learning. And long story short, what they found was that if you had people, if you just simply ask them, either in before or after the augmented feedback, how do you think you did? It led to an improvement in learning because by just asking, how do you think you did? It made them even concentrate more on what they just did. So it's improving the cognitive aspect. So that's such a simple thing that you could do, that you could just say, how do you think you did? And it's focusing on improving that, like it's just reiterating that whole cognitive aspect when talking about the stages of learning. That's important in the beginning stages of learning. Sorry. And so here we have, this is the study where they had participants estimating their own errors. And what they did was they had one group where a control group, they had a group where you estimated your own errors, and then they had a group where you estimated the errors of someone else. And they found that the benefit happened when you evaluated your own self, which makes sense. Because it's improving your own error detection capabilities and improving. Yeah, where's Drew today? No energy. It's all good. It's okay. It's okay, bro. We'll have our days. This was just where they looked at maybe if you delay of getting there could be better if you delay in giving them feedback, like after a couple trials, there may be a benefit. not super important. And now let's talk about, remember we said that it's traditionally, is it better to get feedback all of the time or less than all of the time? We've already talked about it. Traditionally, they thought that it was important to get feedback 100% of the time, whereas now we understand that it's better to not get feedback all the time because it allows for having the person figure things out for themselves. That makes sense, right? And this was the study that showed it. Now, what it showed was that there's two groups that got feedback half the time, and then groups that got feedback 100% of the time. People that got 100% feedback, so a feedback 100% of the time, performed better in practice, but then in a test situation, they'd actually perform the least. So they learned less. Whereas the people that got the feedback only 50% of the time, they did worse in practice, but because they were learning it for themselves, they actually learned it better. Does that make sense? And so why is that? Because it improves the cognitive aspect. So that being said, how do you decrease the amount of time you give feedback? And it's usually with performance bandwidths. You can have people self-select. So usually when they're in let's say they are, you have your beginners or your learners, you have them like figure out for themselves when they want. You have them ask for it. They'll ask when they're frustrated or they need information. And then when they don't, when they're in a groove, they just won't ask. Or what you could do is you could give a summary or average after they're done. And so this was one study that looked at that. Cool. And so this is how we're finishing off the lecture today. So what would be sort of the motor control basis behind why a reduced frequency of feedback is more beneficial for learning? Anyone? By providing feedback less than 100% of the time, you're encouraging the participants to to engage in their own problem solving. By giving them information or augmented feedback every sort of trial, you may be taking their attention away from what they're doing. And then, yes, exactly, Irani, they become dependent on that feedback. So these are the three reasons. And it's called the guidance hypothesis. It just came from a study. So did you guys find that this lecture was difficult at all, or hopefully you found it interesting? Irani. Irani. Like that? Irani? So, screwing it up. Can I just make you a nickname? Awesome. Cool. All right, guys. Any other questions? It's okay. It's being recorded, Drew, so you can just watch it after. You guys are very welcome. You can ask me about the lab. However, because they were changed, I got to be honest with you guys. Like, I know less about the labs than the TAs do. But like, if you want, Jordan, email your TA, CC me on it, because then I'll be aware of it. Because a lot of students are asking me the same questions, and then if I know the answer, then I could just I'm probably no fault of them. I'm faster probably at answering emails than they are, even though I have 3 jobs. I think it's 7, 8, and then 9, 10. Courtney. Yeah, they might be available to be released right now. We'll check after this. I was gonna patient. Cool. Okay. Bye, guys. Third wave is coming. Third wave. Have a great week. Be safe.